join today. My name is Zachary Gersten, and I'm the technical manager of this session on food environments, both global and local, which is chaired by Nilofer Fatemi Safdar, who's joining us today. Thank you so much for taking part in ANH 2021. We're on our last day of the research conference. We look forward to our robust and interactive sessions. Just a reminder that everything you might need is available on our website. You can take a look at our program and the presentation materials at anh-academy.org/ANH2021. And so before our chair takes the conversation forward, I just have a few technical announcements to make sure our experience is as smooth and as interactive as possible, but I'm sure you all are experts at this point, so I'm sure this is kind of a repetition. But first, as you know, the session will be recorded and posted on the website following the conference. You've all been muted upon entry to the Zoom room, but please introduce yourselves using the chat on the side. We want to hear who you are, maybe where you're calling in from, and what organization you work with and represent. Please, we encourage you to share your webcam video, but totally understand if it's too much of a bandwidth and everything. Later on in the session, or we'll have Q&A throughout the session. So I'll make sure to, and so if you post your questions in the chat, we'll be able to make sure they're addressed during that Q&A session. And then if you experience any technical issues, first step is to double check your audio and internet connections. And then second step would be to just leave the Zoom room and come right back in. You can use the exact same link and password. And if you do experience any continuing issues, definitely send me a message over the chat. I'll help you out. So thanks so much. I think I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to our chair. Get started.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to people all around the world. My name is Nilofer Fatemi Safdar. I work at the Dow University of Health Sciences School of Public Health, and right now I'm the adjunct faculty, so I'm talking to you people from Toronto. And today is the third day of the ANH 2021 conference, and we are very excited to have all our speakers and participants for this session on food environment, local and global. And we have about 5 speakers in this sessions. And if some of you might have attended yesterday's sessions on food environment, where they talked about urban and rural, you can understand that food environment is sort of a wider term, where we talk about how your food is influenced, or how your diet that you get on your plate is influenced by so many factors. Whether it is local, global, urban, rural, your family, your culture, your traditions, economics, availability, storage. So we do realize the food environment is a very wider term. And we expect that our speakers, and I've read their abstracts, and I find that they have all covered different areas in that under the title of global and local. So without further delay, I will start calling upon our first speaker. And so we can start the session. And as Zach told you, that while the session is going on, we will have the first 2 speakers who will talk about their research, and then we will respond to the questions in the chat box as well as the Q&A window. And then we will go back to the other 3 speakers. So I hope this works out for both the speakers and the participants, so that we don't forget questions that we may want to respond to. So how about, so our first speaker is Dr. Catherine Merkel, and her topic is Critical Food System Interventions for Improving Nutrition Security in Ghana. She belongs to ACDI VOCA. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So as Nilofer mentioned, my name is Catherine Merkel, and I will be presenting on critical food system interventions for improving nutrition security in Ghana. And these will be the findings from a food security, or sorry, from a food environment analysis. So let's see. So the purpose of this study was to identify appropriate interventions to improve nutrition-sensitive interventions as part of a market systems resilience project. We were looking for leverage points along the food supply chain to make the food environment more nutritious. We also hoped to understand the dietary impacts of market shocks in the area where we were studying, particularly those from COVID-19. We carried out this study in three of the northernmost regions in Ghana, and it had a pre-specified focus of 5 commodities, which were a mix of legumes and cereals. We collected this data in August of 2020. So before I jump into our methods and finding, I wanted to give a brief overview of how we conceptualize the food environment at ACD Avoca. We understand the food environment not as a physical space, but rather as the interface of contexts and factors that the consumer will experience when they go to obtain food. We see the environment as being shaped by the food, agriculture, and market systems that are responsible for producing, processing, storing, distributing, processing, and selling food, as well as the individual characteristics that dictate consumer preferences and knowledge. To understand how to improve the diet of these end market consumers, we must understand the barriers and opportunities at both the systems outer level, as well as the individual level in the middle there. This shapes our approach to the food environment analysis that I'll be presenting. My colleague Alyssa Grudy will also be using this similar conceptualization at the end of this session on a similar food environment analysis in India. So to understand the individual characteristics that dictate consumers' preferences and priorities, in each of the 3 regions, we conducted a household level survey to understand consumption, household diet diversity, and the demographics of the people that we were looking at. We also held focus group discussions with both men and women, one in each of the districts. In these focus discussions, we discussed their food preferences, their beliefs, their knowledge around diet, what they wanted to be eating. To understand more of the systems level, we conducted interviews with vendors and food processors of those 5 focus commodities, as well as interviewed a market manager and conducted in each of the regions a survey of market food price and availability. We found that in general, diet diversity wasn't the lowest that it could be, but it was not ideal, particularly for the poorest households. This table shows a 24-hour diet diversity by income tertile, and we were adjusting this for household and regional characteristics. And we can see that diets significantly increase in diversity as income increases. In general, regardless of the consumption that our interviewees reported, they said that they wanted to be consuming more nutritious, more quality, and more safe foods. However, we did find that they were very constrained by price when they sought out more nutritious foods. This finding was validated by our market price survey, where we found that nutritious foods were in general much more expensive. For example, animal source foods were on average 7.8 times more expensive than staple foods at the market. The most frequent nutrient-rich foods that were consumed were leafy greens and dried fish. Households were producing leafy greens themselves, but they were highly seasonal. Dried fish, on the other hand, needed to be obtained nearly exclusively from the market. Reflecting this sensitivity to price that consumers expressed, we found that households had a strong preference to store and consume their own productions of cereal crops, especially maize. This box plot shows the average length of time that the maize storage for each household lasted, broken up by income tertile, and again, adjusted for household and regional characteristics. As you can see, the households with the higher wealth quintile were their stores lasted significantly longer than those in the lowest quintile. On average, each income tertile predicted significantly an additional 2 months of storage, with the wealthiest being able to store their maize up to 4 months longer than the poorest households, meaning that poorest households had to rely on markets sooner to meet their food needs and for a longer period of time. The protein-rich leguminous crops that I mentioned, soybean, groundnut, lasted an even shorter time, with soy stores depleting after an average of 6 months and groundnut depleting typically in 5 months. So because households were relying on markets for staples primarily during the lean season, we found that market closures impacted diet diversity more than food quantity, while the stocks of cereals that the households were holding lasted. However, around 10 months after harvest, when the majority of household stocks had depleted, nearly all households were reliant on markets to meet both their caloric as well as their diet diversity needs. This meant that shocks in the market during harvest season only had a meaningful detrimental impact on diet diversity, whereas shocks in the lean season could be potentially much more hazardous to households, both in terms of overall food security as well as the quality of the diet. Larger households expressed more concern about food insecurity. Increase in the number of adults in the household significantly predicted increased worries about market closures, likely due to their greater reliance on the markets to meet food needs, since their stores would have to be distributed over more people. Wealthier households, on the other hand, expressed fewer concerns, perhaps due to their ability, as we saw in the previous slide, to store staple foods for longer. In talking to vendors and processors of the focus commodities, we found that they expressed similar constraints around capital, knowledge, and access to storage. All of the retailers that we spoke to had several barriers regarding being able to provide high quality products at low prices that they knew their customers demanded. One of the reasons for this was that they had difficulty sourcing reliably high quality material, especially outside of the harvest season. Without access to storage, they were unable to acquire the stock while prices were low in the harvest season so that it could be then sold in the lean season when demand was highest. Both groups reported a need to access financing so that they could try alternative business models, such as allowing consumers to buy on credit, as well as, particularly for processors, to improve their capacity to produce higher quality foods and to use, for example, better quality packaging. Processors expressed a knowledge of consumers' demand for higher quality, safer products, but were uncertain how to meet these demands and needed more technical input and technical advice in order to achieve those demands. So based on our findings, we developed several recommendations for this market system intervention project. To enhance availability and affordability, we suggest improving access and knowledge of the use of improved post-harvest handling and storage facilities to allow both retailers and households to store their crops for longer. This would allow retailers to purchase stock during the harvest season when prices were lowest and sell when demand was highest, and would allow households to use their own cereal stocks for longer, thus saving them money that they could then use to make diversification purchases of food. To allow retailers to price more competitively, we recommend linking vendors and retailers to allow for cooperation and equipment sharing, as well as bulk purchasing. Acknowledging that cooperation among competing businesses is unlikely on its own, this intervention would also need to be implemented in parallel alongside technical support and financing to allow for diversification in products offered, as well as reaching new end markets. Finally, the demand that customers express for safer, more nutritious food products should be enhanced. And we can do that by connecting processors to business development services and financing that allows for them to diversify their products that the consumers are demanding, as well as using nutrition-sensitive advertising and marketing to reinforce consumers' demand and to demonstrate that their products can meet that demand. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. And I would now immediately call upon the second speaker, and I would really appreciate if you could limit your talk to the time limits. I will call upon Thai Lee from the Bonyard University, UK. So his topic is, what are the world's diet? Identifying common trends of food consumption around the world. Thai, please go ahead and start. Floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the presentation. What are the world's diets and identifying common trends of food consumption around the world? First, I would like to give a quick introduction. My research is motivated by the obesity epidemic. And obesity, or weight gain in general, is caused by an energy imbalance between the calories consumption and calorie expenditure. And globally, there has been an increase in the amount of calories consumed via energy-dense food, but a decrease in the amount of calories expended via physical activity due to the sedentary lifestyle. And acknowledging the multiple drivers of obesity and the rising trends in obesity, my research, however, will focus only on the calorie consumption, the first part of this equation. And the aim is to summarize the evolution of global patterns of food consumption and to identify major dietary trends. To achieve this aim, we use data from the Food and Agricultural Organization, the Food Balance Sheet, and specifically, we explore the annual calories available for human consumption expressed in kilocalories per capita per day. I just want to emphasize that the food waste at household level is not incorporated into these figures. Therefore, the data are best understood as the food availability rather than food consumption. And the data is available for 118 countries over the period from 1961 to 2013. We use cluster analysis to identify the groups of countries so that countries within the same cluster are similar to each other and dissimilar to countries in other clusters. And this cluster analysis is motivated by two problems. First, we're interested to know if a country is characterized by a single diet. By this, I mean, is there such a thing as a national diet, or does that term national diet better reflect the coexistence of multiple diets or dietary trends within a country? And to address this problem, we adopt the fuzzy clustering to allow a country to belong to more than one cluster. And secondly, it is interested to capture the dependence among the diets across national borders, and we adopt the coupler function to allow this. So the novel combination of these two methods would reveal clusters of countries with similar dietary trajectories. The analysis identifies 2, 4, and 6 clusters, and I'm going to give a quick overview regarding each of these solutions. So for the 2 cluster solution, The graph on the left-hand side shows the daily evolution in the daily calories for cluster 1 and cluster 2. Cluster 1, denoted by the solid line, accounts for 94% of the global population. And the diet associated with this cluster shows a rising calorie consumption over time. And cluster 2 also shows an increase in the amount of calories in 2013 compared to the beginning period, but there is a dip in the early 1990s. Increasing the number of clusters to 4, the graph on the right-hand side shows cluster 1, the blue line now accounts for almost 3/4 of the population, show increasing calorie consumption over time. Cluster 2 and cluster 3, the purple and the brown lines, also show the rising trends, but with a dip in 1970s and in 1990s. Interestingly, cluster 4, the green line in this graph, accounts for only 4% of the global population, shows somewhat decreasing calories in 2013 compared to 1961. Regarding the 6 cluster solution, this graph shows the biggest cluster, cluster 2, the purple line, still shows a monotonic rising trend over time. Cluster 6, the gray line here, accounts for 3% of the global population, and it shows a decreasing calorie in 2013 as compared to 1961. The remaining clusters all exhibit rising trends, but with different speeds. So overall, regardless of the number of clusters, the analysis detects predominant trends, monotonic rising calories experienced by the majority of the global population, and a minor trend reducing calories. Interestingly, we obtain a unique cluster, cluster 3, in this graph, which has been the most calorific over the period under review, but it is the only cluster that has not become more calorific since 2000. And further analysis shows that this behavior is attributed by the lower consumption of animal fats, sugar, and milk, but higher consumption of fish and starchy roots. So just to conclude, this research shows that 80% of the global population is on a path of consuming an ever-increasing, more calorific diet with little evidence of a slowdown. And this rise in the calories can act as an early warning for the rise of obesity in populations with currently lower rates. Therefore, current attempts to improve diets are inadequate, and existing efforts need to be redoubled. On a positive side, however, changes towards better diets are possible. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, and keeping your time limit. I really appreciate it. Zach, I just want to check with you. Do we have questions, or should we wait till we get more questions to discuss these 2 speakers? I'm just checking with you. I don't see any right now.
Yeah, I saw the same, no questions yet for our speakers, but I can go ahead and allow participants to unmute themselves. So if you have a question that you would like to ask,
yeah,
verbally,
so they can ask the question if they want to right now. Yeah, can you unmute those people? I mean, if they, how do they address the question? By raising hand, or?
Yeah, how about participants raise their hand if you have a question, and we can call on you to start, just so we don't have 2 people going at one time.
Okay. should we move on to the third speaker? And then maybe I have few questions, but I don't want it to take the time of the participants. So I will leave it at, so shall we move to the third speaker?
I think so.
Okay. Okay, Mark. So now our third speaker, I really like the topic, vegetable advocates. I read his abstract and I really like this term, vegetable advocates, insights into community level barriers and facilitators to vegetable access in the UK. An online photo elicitation study. And it's Mark Spires from Centre for Food Policy, City University of London, UK. So go ahead, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you all today, and thanks, Nilofer, for that introduction. As you can tell from my title, I'll be sharing with you my recent experience working with people in the 4 UK nations who are actively involved in their communities and promoting healthy food. So I asked them specifically about their unique experiences on barriers and facilitators to vegetable access within their communities, and I'll share with you some of my findings today. Quickly, before I do so, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Amber Wheeler from the Food Foundation, who also contributed to the study but couldn't be with us today. Just by way of some brief background, the study was conducted as part of the Peas Please project, which is a UK-wide initiative run by the Food Foundation in partnership with various food-related in-country organizations whose logos you can find at the bottom of your screen. The primary objective of Peas Please is to make it easier for all to access and consume veg, particularly those living on a lower income. As part of this effort, they work with policymakers and retailers, and specifically and relevant to this presentation, they work with civil society, and they do this through various engagement activities. As part of these activities, they seek to understand the barriers to access and consumption of veg by listening to the lived experiences of people and then communicating this to policymakers and retailers. So those members of the public that are involved in these engagement activities are known as Veg Advocates. And these Veg Advocates represent people from all walks of life, just with a common interest in making healthy food, particularly vegetables, more accessible to people in their local communities and beyond. So part of my involvement as an academic partner on Peas Please is to assist them in gaining these insights into barriers and facilitators to veg access. And so to this end, I convened a series of 2 focus group style photo elicitation workshops with a select number of Veg Advocates in each of the 4 UK nations. These workshops were originally designed to be face-to-face, but were ultimately delayed and moved online due to the pandemic. However, this did provide me the opportunity to take and approach these photo elicitation workshops, which I've done previously to that, and to move it to an online space to see how effective it could be. Both workshops were guided by 2 questions. The first that was posed to the participants was, what do you think it makes it easier for people in your community to access veg? And the second was the inverse of that. What makes it more difficult to do so? Participants were asked to give their perspectives on these questions, both in their personal capacity, but also as well as those involved in various food-related activities within their communities. So it was quite a unique experience and perspective that they brought to answering those questions. In the first workshop, we started to speak and discuss the ideas of communities and food environments. Participants were asked about these terms and how they understood them, as well as why communities, including the physical spaces that they occupy, are so important. So in response to the first question, consensus in all workshops centered on 2 things. Firstly, the physical surroundings or conditions in which they lived, so the built environment, schools, homes, neighborhoods, infrastructure, healthcare facility, and stores, including food retail outlets. And then secondly, the people and the relationships in their communities. So community meant to them both their physical space that they occupied, as well as those personal and interpersonal relationships. In response to the second question, the general feeling was that their communities and immediate environment strongly influenced their thoughts, desires, behaviors, or practices, which led to their habits and ultimately largely defined who they were, with a particular focus, of course, on food and related practices. So we then discussed and clarified the term food environment. Ultimately, the definition given by Turner et al. And Turner, Chris and colleagues, as part of the ANH food environment working group brief was given. And that is that the food environment is essentially the interface that mediates one's food acquisition and consumption with the wider food system, encompassing multiple dimensions such as availability, accessibility, affordability, desirability, convenience, marketing, and properties of food sources and products. And so all these different terms within the definition were discussed with and defined for the participants. The participants themselves were then asked to make a list of all facilitators and barriers to vegetable access in their communities that they could think of. So essentially a comprehensive list of both. Key facilitators and barriers were briefly presented by each participant to the rest of the group. An assignment was then given by myself to the participants to be completed before the second workshop to prioritize just 2 barriers and 2 facilitators from these comprehensive lists, and to document these by taking photographs of something in their communities that they felt best depicted these factors. They were also asked to write accompanying captions for these photographs that explained what was in the photograph and why they took the image. The resulting photographs were then used during the second workshop to facilitate a further more detailed discussion around these facilitators and barriers. Another assignment was then given during the second workshop for the participants to generate a list of 5 prioritized solutions that they felt could be taken to overcome these barriers or to promote the identified facilitators. And then a thematic analysis approach was adopted by myself to analyze the comprehensive lists of facilitators and barriers, as well as the lists of possible solutions through which I identified common themes. Workshop participants overwhelmingly cited poverty or limited income in their communities as the overarching barrier to vegetable access. And for those of us who've been doing work in food environment research for quite some time, that might not come as much of a surprise. This, combined with the generally experienced convenience of unhealthy food versus the relative inconvenience of healthy foods, as well as the time and energy given to other perhaps more pressing priorities in low income households, was reported to lead to lower rates of veg access and consumption. Other specific barriers included those at the household level, for example, a lack of sufficient knowledge or skills regarding meal planning and preparation, and those at the immediate community level, which included ubiquitous presence of unhealthy food advertising or the lack of adequate public transportation or other transportation options. Just briefly, as my time is coming to an end, experienced facilitators included vegetable delivery services, including CSAs and veg boxes, existing allotments and other community garden initiatives, and the diversity and reasonably low price of vegetables offered by local supermarkets. Participants concluded that potential solutions to overcome these barriers or promote identified facilitators included the following: community-based initiatives to increase community members' knowledge and skills related to veg cooking and household planning. Oops, sorry about that. An increase in the promotion of veg in the community and in local stores through effective advertising initiatives, the implementation of community-wide health promotion campaigns, as well as other food-related initiatives like veg box schemes and CSAs. Veg Advocates also communicated the need to localize the food system and increase the amount of land for allotments. So in addition to these specific solutions and in line with existing research, overall it was found that efforts to increase household income levels and purchasing power as a result may go a long way to increase veg access and consumptions in communities across the UK, particularly for low income households. Also, as an approach, using an established photo elicitation method in an online forum proved to be effective in not only gaining insights into people's perspectives and veg access in the communities, but also in informing participants about the role that local food environments play in either hindering or supporting this access. To date, workshop findings have been written up in nation-specific reports to be shared back to the Veg Advocates that participated and other stakeholders. Additionally, photos used in these workshops will be displayed in an upcoming online photo exhibition to be hosted by the Food Foundation on their website, to which appropriate stakeholders will be invited, including retailers and relevant policymakers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated, Mark. That was an excellent presentation. And as we had our previous speakers as well, they talked about diversified situation and factors that affect the food environment and that eventually affects the type of diet that we all eat on a plate. Zach, is it okay if we take a couple of questions now and then move on to the next two speakers? Are the speakers okay with that? Okay, okay. So, how do I go to the question session? I'm just, okay.
We just sent you the link to the spreadsheet.
Okay, go back again to the spreadsheet? Okay,
Yes.
I guess so. Okay, I have it in front of me. So the first question is, could you identify, and it is addressed to both screen name. Oh, I think it's addressed to I think it's addressed to Lee. Could you identify if the clusters also relate to different regions? What countries belong in the different countries? I guess in different clusters. I would assume that's what he meant, what she meant. And for two clusters, there's a large drop in calories between 1990 and 2000. Do you have an explanation for this? Thai, this is about the cluster analysis that you did in order to drive the different groups and the different countries. Would you like to address this question?
Hi, yes, thank you very much for the question. Really interesting. For the first one, if the cluster relate to different regions, I would say that unfortunately no, which is quite surprising. But however, on related research that we published last year with a similar method, but we just on a technical point, we use not the level of calorie consumption, but the growth rate of calories. And we also identify different clusters according to the dietary types, not dietary trends, like in this research. And in that publication, the clusters do carry the territory regional meaning. Like, for example, just to give an example, we found tropical diet, a cluster named tropical diet, which corresponds very well to diets of the South American countries. Or we found cluster that we named the traditional diet, which correspond to diets of many African countries. And we found Western diet, which of course correspond to like many Western countries. So that is on the other publication, but in the research that I presented today, the clusters do not carry the regional meaning. And regarding to your second question about the drop in the calories between 1990s and the we were quite surprised to find this decreasing pattern. And we tried to find explanation for this. Some research advocate to the lower in the physical activity levels, which in turn require less calorie consumption. However, we don't find this explanation convincing. The most interesting explanation we found is justified by a publication by the WHO and the FAO, and they attributed the drop in the calories availability in the 1990s to the drop in the calorie availability in the transitional countries. And because each country contributes to the cluster due to the nature of the fuzzy clustering method, the drop is apparent in the graph.
Okay, thank you, Lee. I've done in some of my work cluster analysis, and I've derived diets. And maybe you're right that it is very difficult to say that this cluster type of diet belongs to this specific region. And probably you would, sometimes when you do further analysis in cluster analysis, when you say sub-cluster, then you're likely to see that it could be Pacific region, or it could be sub-Saharan region or African region, that you would have a group of population that would be following probably Western diet or a combination of traditional diet. So it's a very interesting statistical analysis method to come out with some kind of answers to the type of trends that are running around the world. Thank you, Lee. Okay, so our next question quickly is to Catherine. So Lydia asks, have you published this work, and what is the future research directions? Catherine?
Hi, thank you. No, this data has not been published yet. That's something that I would love to talk to Lydia more about, thinking about how we can share that. She said she would be doing some work in Uganda. And the future direction for this is, you know, as an implementer at ACD IVOCA, there's a lot of opportunities to apply this type of on-the-ground, practical, actionable research towards better implementing future interventions to improve food security. So hopefully that's where we will be able to apply these recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. The next two questions are addressed to Mark. And the first question is from Anna. She's asking, how would you say your conclusion from the UK work, such as increasing land allotments to grow fresh food, might generalize to low-income countries where there's a large rural farming population?
Yeah,
Mark,
I think that, yeah, okay. Thanks for the question. I think it's an important one because, you know, one of the things that I found, and most people have found in food environment research, is that context is crucial. Understanding context, although there might be policies that are universal in changing food environments for the better, it's important to understand local context. And so I would be very hesitant to say that the findings that I found in the UK are applicable to other jurisdictions, especially to lower income communities where contexts are quite different, or lower income countries or settings or jurisdictions where contexts are quite different. And other priorities might be found there. But having said that, there was a great quote that came out of the from ANH with their summary last, when was it? Not of yesterday, the first day of the conference, that said, "My story is different, but is not unique." And so as we do more food environment research across different countries and settings and different contexts, although we find different stories, some of the main findings that come out of the importance of food environments and potential ways to alter those spaces to make healthier options more accessible are not so different. So for example, lowering price as a barrier to veg consumption is something that's almost universal and comes up quite a bit, and there are a few others. But that's just one interesting thing in relation to that I found in my food environment work across different countries.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Mark, you have a couple of more questions because the concept of vegetable advocates and using the photo elicitation is something that a lot of us do not use in our research, especially like going further from the focus group and then identifying barriers and facilitators, and then using one of those, what they have said in the focus group, to use photo elicitation to mark what they actually say is an interesting thing. So I would say the second, with the vegetable boxes, did participants feel that the vegetable boxes met their food preferences? Would you like to address that?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of questions about veg boxes.
Yeah, I also would like to ask, and if you can answer that question.
Yeah, so veg boxes and these seasonal delivery services, it was quite an interesting point, and there was a lot of discussion and back and forth about that in all the different focus groups across all nations, but particularly in Wales for some reason. The overall consensus was that veg boxes were a good thing. There were some issues that were raised around the cost of veg boxes. It's something that's not readily used or known by everyone universally. Lower income groups were, it was discussed that lower income groups were less likely to use them because it wasn't known, it wasn't part of common practice, and the barrier of price. Because some of these veg box schemes have to charge a little higher for their veg than that you can pay for in supermarkets. So there were some issues around veg boxes that were raised, but ultimately, after all the discussions in looking at their suggestions, these kinds of schemes came up quite a bit as ways to overcome some of the barriers to veg access. There was something else I wanted to say.
Yeah, there was also that poverty was a key barrier to accessing vegetables. Did food banks came up in the discussion? And any insight into the differences and challenges for urban and rural consumers?
Yeah, food banks came up a bit too, depending on, mainly because some of our veg advocates either volunteered or ran food banks. They didn't come up, I think in one of my solutions or recommendations from the veg advocates, I had a little caveat that said in other food related initiatives that need to be expanded. I think it fell within that bracket. So they did come up as something that was beneficial and should be supported, whether it's financially or whatever it might be. So food banks did come up. The urban versus rural is also an interesting question. I didn't look at this specifically. I had hoped to conduct workshops in separate urban versus rural to be able to look at differences. But that wasn't something that I was in the end able to specifically look at. So I would be hesitant to comment on that.
Okay.
But we know that urban and rural communities do face similar but different challenges in accessing veg.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we will leave that discussion because that is a very interesting discussion. When we talk about, we assume that people who live in the rural areas would be getting good vegetables and fruits. But sometimes we do not realize the other factors that interplay into their own access to their own food productions. So, Zach, how are we doing with the time? I just want to confirm before I move on to the fourth speaker.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, we should move on, but come back to some of the questions that I know are being posed to some of our previous speakers.
Okay, so let's move on to our fourth speaker, and we are excited to welcome Jessica Bogart from CSIRO, Australia. And Jessica will talk about development of a food environment typology for the Pacific region. Kin and community is an overlooked source of food. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Greetings from Australia. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I'm sharing the results of recent work from a Pacific Food Systems project, which was funded by ACIR. And I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of my co-authors listed here. So as we know, the food environment, including all of the places and pathways through which people acquire food, are a key leverage point for influencing diets in terms of what food is available, their price, quality, how they're promoted, etc. But approaches to their assessment are underdeveloped, particularly in the Pacific region. This is changing and literature has really advanced in this space recently. But we found in this work that existing frameworks didn't quite capture the diversity of food environments that are relative relevant in the Pacific region, particularly in relation to community and kinship relationships and networks that are a crucial source of food and have really strong historic and cultural roots in the region. So our broad aim in this project was just to begin to characterise the food environment in the Pacific region and start to identify potential leverage points to improve diets. So if I break that down, we had 3 research questions. The first being, what are the food environments in the Pacific? So we developed a topology of food environments, adapting existing frameworks and then seeking key stakeholder input from the region. And we've identified 6 primary food environments, which I show here. So of course we have the wild, which includes the bush, forests, reef and oceans, rivers, estuaries, mangroves, etc. Then the cultivated food environment, which includes backyard gardens, which are very common throughout the Pacific, as well as the more commercially oriented production systems like plantations and aquaculture. Noting that these are only considered a food environment when people source food from them directly, which is common, for example, from the owner or a worker of the plantation. Then we have the kin and community food environment, which we define as the network of social relationships through which people acquire food. And so this includes purchasing or trading food with relatives or neighbours, which we know is very common in the Pacific. Cultural and social gatherings, as well as food remittances. So this is where people send food, often fish or root vegetables, between provinces and particularly from rural areas to urban centres. Then you have the more common informal retail, like your local markets, kiosks and mobile vendors. Then your formal retail like supermarkets and stores. And then food aid and services, including institutional food provision. And the symbols along the bottom are showing the primary exchange mechanisms, which are commonly used in the various food environment types. So our second question was then, how important are these different food environments in the diets of different population groups? So to answer this, we did a secondary analysis of a large nationally representative household income and expenditure survey from the Solomon Islands. And in this survey, about 4,500 households kept food diaries for 2 weeks, where they recorded the quantities of food acquired along with the source of those foods. So we recoded over 300,000 free text descriptions of the source of food according to our topology. And so this is some primary results. The graph is showing the proportion of the total quantity of food acquired according to these different food environments. So nationally and then for different subgroups. So you can see overwhelmingly at this national level, about 60% of the total quantity of food acquired is coming from the cultivated food environment. This is followed by the wild food environment, accounting for about 15% of total food acquired. The kin and community food environment, shown in the blue here, at around 9% of total food. And then your formal and informal retail food environments, which were each accounting for about 8% of total food acquired. Now, as you'd expect, there's large differences between the urban and rural populations, with some differences across the provinces and particularly Honiara, which is an exclusively urban area. I think it's interesting to look at the different wealth groups. So here you can see that reliance on wild food environments was relatively consistent at around 15% of total food acquired, as well as kin and community, which was also relatively consistent at around 8% of total food acquired. And then you can see a fairly clear reduced reliance on the cultivated food environment as wealth increases, with an increasing reliance on your formal and formal retail food environments as wealth increases. So this leads us to our third research question, which was, is there a relationship between reliance on these different food environments and diet quality? So we addressed this through a descriptive analysis of food groups provided through the different food environments. And then we did a multivariate regression analysis to look at reliance on each of these different food environments and 2 proxies for diet quality, whilst controlling for all of the usual potential confounding variables like location and wealth group. So this graph is showing you the proportion of the total quantity of different food groups that are acquired from the various food environments. So you can see here the overwhelming majority of roots and tubers, fruits and vegetables are being sourced from the cultivated food environment. Fish and seafood, the overwhelming majority is being sourced from the wild food environment. And then your majority of breads and cereals, oils and fats, and discretionary foods are being sourced from the formal and informal retail food environments. Kin and community plays a much more variable role. It's shown by the navy blue bars, most notably as a source of meat, which is consistent with meat being commonly consumed as part of cultural feasts and celebrations in the region. And from our regression analysis, we found several statistically significant relationships. So the green arrows are showing you where it was a good thing for diet quality, and then the red arrows are showing where it was a negative thing for diet quality. So you can see reliance on the cultivated, the wild, and the kin and community food environments were all positive predictors of fruit and vegetable acquisition. Whilst reliance on formal retail was a significant negative predictor of fruit and vegetable acquisition, as well as a positive predictor of ultra-processed food acquisition. So this is my last slide. As a key conclusion, I guess, was that our analysis really reaffirms the importance of natural resource management, particularly in terms of local agriculture and fisheries. They're really crucial for diet quality. And so interventions in this space are potentially likely to be more impactful than perhaps an overemphasis on retail food environments. I think kin and community is an important but overlooked source of food with strong historic and cultural ties. And I think it's potentially an important feature of food environments beyond the Pacific region that needs more attention. I think in understanding the drivers of diet quality in the Pacific, we need to think more broadly than the typical retail food environments and really work on developing the tools and methods to characterize them. And I think using a food environment topology like the one that we've presented here in the data collection phase of regularly conducted surveys, such as household income and expenditure surveys, could really go a long way to helping us inform interventions to improve diet quality. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. And if you'd like any further info, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It is so interesting to hear you talking about how you can actually define food environment, and it is like you can divide the food environment into so many areas and factors. And I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but for the time constraint, we will leave the questions in the end. But I will quickly move to our fifth speaker. A fifth speaker is Elisa Grood, and she will be talking about comparing local food system for tribal versus non-tribal groups in southern India, findings from implementing a food environment analysis to inform nutrition-sensitive programming. And Elisa is from ACDI VOCA organization. Elisa, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. So as was just mentioned, ACDI VOCA implemented under our sister organization, Tanager, a food environment analysis for identifying appropriate nutrition sensitive interventions. The purpose of the food environment analysis was to identify in the Andhra Pradesh Farmer Market Readiness Program how we could potentially improve nutrition behaviors. A bit of background about the program. The program is implemented in Andhra Pradesh, India, and the main goal is to improve productivity and profitability for 13 farmer producer organizations. This is phase 2 of the program. And in the second phase, we are piloting nutrition interventions in 2 of these 13 farmer producer organizations. Given the loftiness and broadness of this goal, the team wanted to implement a food environment analysis to better identify what our consumption behaviors could be, as well as to identify some food environment domains of interest that could be affecting these consumption behaviors. So our food environment domains of interest were here at the bottom. We focus primarily on the personal food environment domains from ANH's food environment framework, and also included in that gender and social dynamics. And then in the external food environment, we focus primarily on availability and price. I won't get too much into the conceptualization of the food environment because my colleague Catherine previously did, so I will jump right into a bit of the methods. The research team implemented the food environment analysis in February to March of 2020 in 2 regions in the Department of Andhra Pradesh. One was non-tribal in Anantapur, and one was tribal in Srikalkulam. There were 3 survey tools that were implemented. We used household surveys to gather data about the consumption behaviors, including a household dietary diversity score, food frequency questionnaire, and then also aspects of the personal food environment domains. We used focus group discussions for personal food environment domains as well, and then used the rapid market surveys to capture information on food availability and price. Jumping right into the findings, the research team identified 2 consumption behaviors of focus. The first one being dietary diversity. So we found that fewer than 50% of households consumed animal source foods, dark green leafy vegetables, and vitamin A-rich fruits and vegetables. The average HDDS was 7.23 for tribal households and 7.62 for non-tribal respondents. And this did vary with the income tertiles, with the lowest income tertile in the tribal group being 6.65 for the HDDS, and that ranged up to 7.66. And the lowest income tertile for the non-tribal respondents was 7.66, and that ranged up to 8.04. Our second behavior of interest was the allocation of foods within the household. We found that foods were not equitably allocated in the household, and this was worse with non-tribal households, as you can see in this graph here, in this table here. What we found across both groups, though, was that this pattern was actually worse with female youth, in which 48% of female youth said they were receiving less diverse foods, and compared to 29% of adult women who said they received less diverse foods. So jumping into some of the food environment domains of interest, the research team identified that food availability, accessibility, convenience, and desirability were influential domains. Starting with food availability and accessibility, we determined that markets and locally produced foods in both of the tribal and non-tribal areas provided sufficient food for a minimally nutritious diet. Tribal villages, however, produced much more of their own food and only purchased the foods here in the parentheses. Non-tribal villages purchased almost all of their foods except for rice, peanuts, bananas, and some dark green leafy vegetables. Interestingly, non-tribal villages had retailers of all the major food groups and had about 5 to 10 vendors in each of the villages surveyed. However, tribal villages had 0 food vendors and had to travel to purchase their foods. This was a large accessibility issue, and 54% of tribal respondents reported traveling greater than 2 hours to procure foods. Moving on to convenience, it was noted quite frequently in the focus group discussions that the relative convenience of a food played significantly into whether a household wanted to prepare and consume that food. And this was cited to be due to the high energy and time burdens of women already from their livelihood development activities. And nonetheless, 73% of survey respondents still reported to spend an average of 2 to 4 hours a day preparing foods. And this was a little higher for the non-tribal respondents. An example of a food that was considered not to be convenient was a dark green leafy vegetable. And it was cited that it was not convenient because each individual leaf had to be cleaned, washed, and then plucked. And that took a long time to do. Moving on to desirability. Positively, households reported that they did want to consume more nutrient-rich foods. However, they cited that food price, seasonality, and therefore availability, and convenience prevented them from consuming these foods. Now, I didn't mention food price too much before, but food price did come up in the focus group discussions, as well as some of the household surveys where we asked about perception of food price and the affordability of them. Households did report that foods were too pricey to consume, but interestingly, in the cost of the diet, we found that a minimally nutritious diet, the cost of that was lower than what households were reporting their food expenditure to be. So this is an area for the research team to keep an eye on, or the implementation team to keep an eye on. Also influencing desirability was the presence of food taboos for nutritious foods. So most often cited were that people couldn't consume foods that were considered to be warm or considered to be cold at specific times, such as during pregnancy. Moving on to recommendations for interventions. So as previously discussed, the team did identify the 2 target behaviors, one being to increase dietary diversity. And we did identify that there were specific foods listed here that were leverage points for increasing the proportion of households that were consuming target nutrient-rich foods. The second was to improve inter-household allocation of foods. To target these behaviors, the team grouped interventions into 3 categories. To address availability and accessibility, the team recommended to develop local productivity and vending in last mile areas of target nutrient-rich foods, specifically for vending in last mile areas for the tribal areas in order to improve accessibility. For convenience, the team recommended to develop processing capacities of local food vendors, as well as those farmer producer organizations, in order to process target nutrient-rich foods into more convenient forms. So an example was to work with food vendors or the FPOs to pre-wash and pre-pluck dark green leafy vegetables and to sell in bag form. To address the gender and social dynamics and desirability, the team decided to integrate social and behavior change activities into ongoing program agriculture and market systems development activities, such as integrating nutrition messaging into farmer trainings, as well as to implement standalone SBC activities to sensitize households on the target behaviors. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the time, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Zach, quickly, can you tell me how much time do we have before we have to close the session? And then I'll quickly move to the questions that were raised on the 2 other speakers.
Yeah, of course. We have about 5 minutes left of our planned session, but there's nothing in between now and between the end of the session and closing. So if we do go a little farther, that's totally
good.
fine.
Thank you very much, because I had a couple of questions as well. Okay, so let's move on to another question that was addressed to Jessica. Is meat from kin and community also related to joint hunting or butchering? Interesting question.
Yes, interesting question. Thank you.
Very interesting question.
It's a little bit hard to say. It depends how people recorded that as a source of food. So I think for the most part, joint hunting would be captured probably by the wild food environment. But if someone wrote down that the source of that food was like the name of a person or their neighbor, or then it would have been included in kin and community. So there certainly is potential for sort of overlap between some of these areas, depending on how it was recorded in the food diary.
Okay, and please stay. There's another question addressed by Catherine to Jessica, did you break down reliance on different food environments by income or household resources?
Yes, good question. We did that in a pretty crude way. So if you go back to one of my slides I've shown, we looked at different wealth quintiles, and it was really interesting to see that kin and community was fairly consistent across those wealth groups. So across each of them, it accounted for around 8% of total food acquired, regardless of wealth group.
Okay, and how social network connectivity determined of kin and community reliance?
Well, I guess that's the key part of, I guess the message that we're sending is that it is an important determinant of food access, and it's something I think that we tend to overlook. It is captured to some extent sometimes in some surveys, in part by gifting of food, but I think it's often sort of brushed to the side, and we don't think of that as a significant source. And so if we are able to integrate sort of more information into our surveys around where people are sourcing food, this I think is really important. Social networks as a source of food. We all share food with others, and so I think that's a really key part of the food environment that we might be missing.
Okay. I guess the way you have divided the food environments into interesting group, it's something that we all researchers and public health specialists and nutritionists should be thinking about, that food environment is a wider term and can encompass so many factors that we saw in all these 5 presentations, and yesterday also when they talked about food environment. So I think it's an interesting concept to understand that how food environment you can divide, and you can consider not just the physical factors, but also social factors and community related factors, or relation related factors as well. There was another question for Jessica. If I understand the models of food environments and diet quality correctly, there's potentially a selection effect into eating specific food items at all that may link to food environment. I'm wondering if you considered any kind of selection model for this. Jessica? Can you read the question?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll just read it. I'm not sure I really understand it from where you're posing it.
The question, if I understand.
If you're asking about sort of food preferences, and I mean, it's not something that we investigated specifically. We're just using data on what food was acquired by households nationally, and then divided into those sort of different groups. But perhaps you could follow up separately, so we can have a bit more of a discussion, so I can understand where you're getting to.
Yeah, I think that's what she's referring to. Were they asked about their preferences, or they were just grouped into the different categories of food environment?
It was just quantitative, based on what food was acquired. Yeah.
Okay. Question for Crude. In the survey, were you able to measure whether households were receiving food items through the public distribution system? And if so, was PDS access associated with diversity?
Yes, thank you for the question. So actually, opposite to Jessica's focus on quantitative, our information, our data on food acquisition was from the focus group discussions. And when I discussed that majority of food for the tribal groups was coming from own production, and majority of food from the non-tribal groups was coming from purchasing, that was, those patterns were identified during the focus group discussions. As far as the public distribution system, this was mentioned in the focus group discussions, though not significantly. It was mentioned more in the tribal groups than the non-tribal groups. And unfortunately, because we didn't do this in terms of a quantitative, like Jessica did, we weren't able to, of course, break down the influence of the different acquisition and effect on dietary diversity.
Okay, thank you. Zach, if there are any questions from the participants, they can also use the raise hand, and I'm sure Zach will unmute them. Otherwise, I will just conclude by giving some remarks in the end. But, or even between the speakers, if they're interested to ask each other any question. I have another question, I think. I think it is to Jessica. If you recorded any sort of temporality when it comes to sources of food environments, food from kinship and communities being tied to certain rituals, events, days, for example. Oh, so probably what she's asking is that when you talk about kinship group, are you talking in terms of certain occasion, certain celebration? Am I right?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. Unfortunately, we can't answer it from the data that we have. So the way that the survey was conducted, it was staggered throughout the year. It's representative of a 12-month period, but unfortunately we can't uncover any trends within that. And we haven't, even though the food diaries were recorded over a 2-week period, we haven't gone to that level of analysis to look if there was any sort of change in terms of the days of the week or anything, although that would be something really interesting to look at in future.
Okay. I think for the time constraint, and I'm sure you all want to take some sort of a break before you go to the closing ceremony, I would like to conclude by saying thank you to all our 5 esteemed speakers. They did a wonderful job keeping the time frame, time constrained, as well as giving us so much information on how you can talk about food environment. So it's not a limited area. And I think so much work has been done by our researchers to let us know what food environment could be. I mean, I learned so much from all the 5 presentation. It is interesting to see in the different part of the world. I mean, we had presenters from different part of the world, and they did different population research of different population from various countries. And somehow now all the researchers who are involved in this thing can look into the various factors and may come out with more factors related to food environment. But what I could conclude from the 5 presentations, that we talked about the season as one of the environment that needs to be considered, harvest time, lean time, income of the family is a very crucial aspect, or economics is a crucial aspect that affects food environment, storage facilities, especially during harvest and off-harvest lean time, that could affect the environment, affordability, desirability of the people who want to eat. That is important. Then we looked into the global patterns of food consumption, and that was again a very good work that was done, looking into the last 50 years of how you could come out with the different patterns of food and how the countries can be allocated. Then we had vegetable advocates. I mean, again, that was a very interesting concept, and using both qualitative and quantitative research into any of these public health domain can be so enriching and can give us so much data, and can really help us to understand that how food environment eventually affects the health and the nutrition of your population. Then again, we talked about the availability, accessibility, convenience, desirability. So I think all of us have learned so much on what food environment encompasses. Thank you very much. I really appreciate, and thank you very much, ANH, for asking me, for letting me chair this amazing session of 5 wonderful speakers talking about so much, and I myself learned a lot on this. Thank you once again, and I conclude this session.
Really quick before you, quick before you all head out, I'm going to launch a really quick poll just to help us learn more about how you engaged in the session. And before the official close of this session, I just want to thank everyone, especially our chair, for leading this session forward today. Our closing ceremony starts at the 55 mark. So we hope to see you all there to officially close out the ANH week, the Learning Labs, the research conference. If you have any questions, please direct them to us via email, and definitely check out our website for videos and other presentation content that we've covered so far. And I think that's about it.
Okay.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Zach, and for helping the administrative part of this session. Thank you again, all the speakers, and hope to see you at the concluding session. So I can close it, Zach? Is it okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.